Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. I am one of your regular hosts, Ken Mugrage. I'm joined today by Dr. Rebecca Parsons.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Parsons, another one of your recurring hosts and CTO Emerita here at Thoughtworks.
Great. So today we have a pretty cool topic. We recently published something we call our sensible defaults on our website. So we wanted to talk to a couple of our community leaders about what that means. So first off, let me introduce Brandon Cook.
Hello, I'm Brandon Cook. I'm the Global Community of Practice Lead for Software Development.
Welcome. And Kief Morris.
Hi there, I'm Kief. I'm the Global Community of Practice Lead for Infrastructure Engineering.
And so first off, let's start with just a definition. I guess either one of you. I know we don't tend to use the words best practice for multiple reasons. What is a sensible default?
So a sensible default is basically something that we think is generally a good idea, barring some reason why, your particular situation, it might not be, right? So it's like, by default, like, for example, we think it's a good idea to pair program. And so unless there's some reason why that's not feasible, we would just go ahead and do that.
What does it not mean?
It's not something that like you must do. You're going to be punished for not doing. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong if you don't. So it's basically, so you mentioned the best practice, right? So it's the contrast with to best practice is that that at least the way that the phrase is often used, best practice, is that this is the best way to do it. No matter what, you should always do it this way. Whereas a sensible default is just kind of like usually good idea. That makes sense.
And I think one of the things that distinguishes the sensible defaults is that there is more of an expectation that you understand the why. So if you're going to choose not to do it, you want to explain why it is that it doesn't fit in your situation, not just, I don't like that. And also how you are going to compensate for the goodness that you got with the default. So you really do have to understand it. Whereas, as Kief pointed out, with the best practice, there's this, if you don't do this, you're bad. But let's not talk about what the goodness is that comes from it or why people say it's this best practice. And I think that's an important part of keeping it from being, the commandments that have come down from on high that thou shalt. It doesn't have that feel to it because it should be much more of an informed conversation about why you were choosing not to do it. And what are the circumstances? And that helps others also learn about what situations might be different than the ones they've encountered in the past.
Yeah. And another thing there as well is with sensible defaults is that there's going to be different nuances and different flavors of it at different organizations as well. So that's where we want to really sort of avoid being super dogmatic that you have to do it this exact way. But we think that these sort of defaults should be things where every team should start off saying, how can we put this into place on our teams in this organization? So really understanding the fundamentals and really understanding the why and the how these things could be done to improve the whole experience for development and the team overall.
It's an interesting point that it's not, it's every organization is not going to use the same necessarily practices or have the same sensible defaults. And I think the thing about when we selected our sensible default practices, when we kind of went through that process of working out, well, what do we think they are? And what do we want to kind of like document as our sensible defaults? Part of it is that they're not obvious, right? So we didn't want to have just kind of generic platitudes like, well, write good quality software, right? Because nobody's going to say, no, I don't think I should write good quality software, actually. And it's not even things that are kind of taken for granted in the industry. Like, one thing we could have considered is like use a source code control system to store your source code. And some years ago, maybe that would be a thing that you would kind of need to point out. But these days, it's you can kind of take that for granted. So we kind of chose ours as ones that we think are maybe not obvious, and not necessarily the defaults for the industry, but are ones that we particularly find effective and think are effective.
So you lead me into the defining of these. So you both introduced yourselves as leaders of different communities of practice. So I know that's who owns sensitive defaults in Thoughtworks. Our listeners don't. So just briefly, what is a community of practice lead at Thoughtworks? So who are the people that develop these sensible defaults? Brandon, you know what? I will start with Brandon because Brandon's relatively new to the role.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I was going to try to let Kief take that, but I'll try to give it a go since I sort of just stepped into the role. But from my understanding, right, we are sort of trying to connect all the dots between the regions and how sort of these sort of sensible defaults are emerging across our organization globally, and make sure that there's alignment across the regions, that these are the expectations that we're setting. Because there will be different nuances and different sort of leanings in the various regions. But we were looking to really just sort of have alignment, especially in this sort of distributed environment where there'll be teams working across different regions and that way. So that's where like the community of practice comes into play globally, working with all the different regions to get that common understanding and that common practice, so that when these teams form, there's a common understanding between everyone.
Yeah, I think it's important because in a lot of places, how you should work, it comes down from on high, if you will. And, at Thoughtworks, our community of practices truly are communities. I'm Kief, you've been part of that community for quite a while. How have the sensible defaults, how have they evolved over the last year or two? Again, in using and leveraging that community as opposed to being, hey, Rebecca, CTO Emerita, what are we supposed to do here?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll actually go back to how we kind of first came up with them, which was, it wasn't that we kind of sat down and said like, okay, what do we think would be good practices to use? So it wasn't kind of aspirational. It was really looking at what do we use? So what has kind of historically been the things that when you joined Thoughtworks? So I joined Thoughtworks about a bit more than 14 years ago now. And I was familiar with kind of agile ways of working and extreme programming and those kind of things. But it was really coming into a project team and working with people that I really got by that kind of experience of working with the people and seeing, what the practices, how they normally would do things, like how would they, structure a story wall to kind of put stories, how would they write up stories and the kind of, those kind of things. And I think it's interesting because they're what I would call them is like norms that have evolved and they weren't necessarily written down, but they were in people's heads. And they were also often things that we would have to explain to people, whether it's to new Thoughtworkers or in client situations where, basically we say, okay, we think it's a good way to work like this. Pair programming is a great example because for a lot of people, that's like a new thing. And so it would be, these were things that we maybe had to kind of do that, make that extra effort to explain why do we think they're effective and for people to get used to doing. And so when we first decided to document these practices, we kind of drew on what we, how we worked and those things that we noticed. And so it wasn't kind of an inventing from scratch. And then over the past kind of year or two, it's really, we're getting feedback from people, from people out there on projects, from new joiners and so on, to kind of see how, how they land and how well they work and the way that we put them together. And so we've kind of gone through and had to kind of do some updates and refreshes and improvements on how we express those.
So I'm going to ask Rebecca. She was the CTO at the time when these really kind of became to the forefront. In a large organization, how did that happen? What made it to where, well, we need to agree on some of these things?
Well, it actually started in Australia, and we had a head of engineering in Australia at the time. His name is Evan Botcher, and unfortunately, he's no longer with Thoughtworks, but he was looking around projects and feeling the need to actually document what our way of working was. And he is actually the person who originally coined this term sensible default. And he was very focused on what would now be in Brandon's scope, almost exclusively, which is the software delivery practices. The things like pair programming. It did go a little bit into some of the other things around project planning. Do you have a risk register? And as Kief pointed out, this is as much the how do you make one of these happen in a way that is supportive of the development process. It's not that startling to think you should have a risk register, but a risk register is not this list of risks that people write down and ignore. There's a process around things like that. And so it's the how do you manifest some of these things that are also important. And as I said, originally it was primarily around software delivery practices. We didn't have formal communities of practice at the time. And so this was something that was initially just used in Australia and then started to expand out globally through the heads of technology in these various countries. When we actually formalized global communities of practice, which we didn't have a formal mechanism, we've always had a very strong software development community, but we hadn't formalized it as part of our organization with particular responsibilities. And when we did that, one of the things that we thought, now we have a Kief and a Brandon and a Kate for experience design, ... And so what we did was thought this was something that can bring the community together globally by saying, okay, let's build upon what Evan has already done, but let's expand it out to include what are the sensible defaults for product? What are the sensible defaults for infrastructure engineering? What are the sensible defaults for program management? And so what we have developed over the past couple of years and have now recently published shows the entire coverage of our various craft communities, these communities of practice. And these sensible defaults have developed as a result of the work that these people are doing across the globe on our various client projects. And so this isn't, I'm sitting, as a professor in a lab and saying, this is a wonderful thing for you to do, but this is sourced from people who are doing the work day in and day out.
So as Kief mentioned, some of these aren't obvious. I mean, some of them might be, but this might be even some of our secret sauce. Why are we publishing this? I guess either Kief or Brandon, why are we telling the world about this?
Yeah, I think that there's a difference between sort of just publishing what we think are like the sensible defaults and then actually putting them into practice, right? So there's one next level on top of just sharing those sort of, here are the sensible defaults that we think you should be following. And then two, like actually implementing them and actually doing them in the best way suited for that organization. So that's where it's like, just sort of sharing our differentiation that these are some of our core sensible defaults that we think can accelerate, help provide better experiences for your teams, better outcomes for your business, right? But then if you want to actually probably do these in the most efficient manner with very experienced practitioners in these areas, then working with us is probably a good choice because we can actually have those folks who've done this on several projects and evolved numbers of organizations to sort of adopt some of these sensible defaults and have seen great success. So yeah, I think that's the key differentiator between like giving away the secret sauce and just sort of sharing what the sauce is, right?
I think it's always been a part of our ethos to share and contribute to the industry, right? And it's always, we've never been the kind of organization where it's we're going to come up with a secret special way to do things and then we're going to keep it to ourselves and you have to come to us if you want to do it. We've always been about like, we come up with ideas, we want to share them, we want the rest of the industry to adopt them if it makes sense for them, right? We want people, we want to kind of drive, and help everyone do better. And I think then the other thing, then going to it, it's like, again, people can see if they're going to work with Thoughtworks, like they can see like, this is what we do. This is how we work. And so it's kind of not going to be, shocking, right? You kind of know what you're in for when you can look at those practices, and I think that's a good thing. And I think that's, and if for some reason, like you really, really don't think that our ways of working are right for you, then that's probably for the best as well, that you know that before coming in.
Yeah. And another thing to add there is, I think it's just like the sharing of knowledge, like Kief just said, is definitely a core part of our culture. And then I guess we're always willing to have a vibrant conversation. Like if you take a sensible default like TDD, there was a vibrant conversation that we had around, is TDD dead, several years ago. Paired programming always has a vibrant conversation with clients. So a lot of these practices, a lot of these sensible defaults are just having great discussions and evolving and being challenged. So that makes them even more bulletproof, because we really have to think about the why, and we have to demonstrate the outcomes of these as well, with our clients.
And so given the fact that I love that word vibrant, discussions around these, I guess I'm going to ask Kief, because I know you've been in this a little bit longer than Brandon. What's the process like? And I know it differs community to community, and there's not a defined process from Thoughtworks, but inside the infrastructure community, what's the process look like of something going from that might be a good idea to, this is our sensible default?
The way we did it was we started with a mural board, a kind of, virtual sticky board, where we put stuff up, and we decided to do it. So we had some sessions where people could kind of join in on Zoom and had these conversations, but we also wanted to make sure we had kind of an asynchronous, ability for people to contribute. So we basically made the board, and we started putting things in there and getting people to put things in there and putting in comments. And we had discussions in our internal forums and the chat rooms and mailing lists, as well as at a few calls where we could kind of have that more interactive conversation. So it was a real process like that. And I also participated, I worked closely with Evan because the infrastructure and software development practices are quite closely related. We worked together actually pretty closely. So on the software ones, we actually had like a document that people could add comments to, and so there were like some really long conversations about some of the practices about like, is this really the right thing, or is it old hat? We had a lot of discussions around the kind of trunk-based development, continuous integration, and whether that was now obsolete, that pull requests were the way to go. And so that was quite an interesting and vibrant thing. And at the end of the day, we just had to kind of go with the consensus, I guess. I mean, we're never going to get a unanimous agreement. But we just, we had to kind of go with this. This really does seem like the consensus overall among the community and among folks, in the conversation, and just kind of like put it and go forward, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the good example from the one that Kief just mentioned around like trunk-based development, right? Like we were really sort of looking at what are the core fundamentals of trunk-based development that we really want to get out. And does that mean that you can't do PRs, or you can't like effectively sort of continuously and frequently integrate your code? So like we wanted to really highlight the core fundamentals that we wanted to seek out. So that's where sort of the phrasing and the framing and the wording of the sensible defaults comes into play, so that we can then go to an organization and work with them and sort of get them on sort of like a maturity roadmap to sort of start adopting this practice and improving their software delivery overall.
I think that's also a good example, because it goes to show. So part of the conversation we had around that in the last round was, so there's a couple of phrases that are obvious. Continuous integration is a well-known phrase. Trunk-based development is a fairly well-known phrase. But we actually opted not to use those as the names for those practices, because we felt like there was a little bit of that, as Martin puts, the semantic diffusion of, continuous integration to a lot of people has come to mean, well, I run a build server on my branches. And so we kind of did that step back and say, like Brandon, like what you just said was like, okay, what's the important things about this, and to make sure to get that. And we use the phrases integrate frequently and continuously, right? So it's like, okay, you can use pull requests, you can use branches, but as long as you're integrating very frequently and very continuously, you're still doing the thing that we're, that we find to be effective.
One of the things that is great about Thoughtworks is the ability to disagree, but still, get the work done and be heard and be able to talk about these things. How do you promote that culture inside the organization where, okay, the sensible default is to do trunk-based development, for example, but because of concerns at our client or, whatever it is, how do you promote that culture where people can say, I get that's a sensible default, but I can't do it here because, and not the, like Brandon said early on, not just because they just don't like it, but, how do you get that to where people are like, okay, I understand this is a sensible default and I need to do this, but I can't in this case, and I feel safe not to?
I guess it's just about in the conversations, like how you handle those conversations. And so when you get somebody saying, well, I'm don't want to use this particular way of working, you always kind of assume good intent. You assume, okay, do you understand why? Maybe you might ask. So I think it's just having those kind of respectful conversations, I guess, and trying to, and we and other people who've been, in the company for a while, I think hopefully kind of provide that leadership and provide that kind of example for newer folks that, it's not just, you don't just pile onto somebody and tell them they're doing wrong, but it's like, you try to have a constructive conversation around it.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a challenge at this, like sort of in this new landscape where everything is remote. I think a lot of the sensible defaults kind of arose at Thoughtworks out of sort of a strong co-located experience where you kind of just got to sit down with very experienced thought workers and you kind of learn these practices because you're just working next to them every day, particularly like pairing. Like you just learn the nuances of pairing when you're sitting right next to someone a lot easier versus where now everything is remote. So trying to be like, get someone who's like interested in pushing for these practices, and then they get any resistance from the client, they're like, oh no, I don't know what to do now, but like, I really want to try this out. Right. So I've never had like an experience where folks aren't wanting to sort of push for these, but any like form of resistance is where they really see the blocker, and they don't have maybe on their team, they don't have the experienced thought worker who's been through that conversation before. So we're working through some of those challenges to sort of enable a lot of folks in this regard, so that then they can have those conversations with the client, they can have those conversations with their team, and they can effectively sort of drive the adoption of the practice going forward.
So I can see a listener seeing this and go, oh, I'm going to run out to thoughtworks.com and look at the sensible defaults because all this AI stuff is new. But oh my gosh, why don't we have any AI sensible defaults? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Because as I said earlier, this comes out of our experience, and we're still learning. We're still experimenting. Everybody is still learning and experimenting with what are the ways that you can use these various AI-enabled practices to get a better outcome. And it's a sensible default because in the majority of cases, this is how something works. And we haven't got that yet. The potential impact of AI across the software delivery lifecycle is such that it's going to impact all of our different communities, and some of them have more tools available to them today. Some of those communities don't have them really available right now, or there's still a lot of innovation going on. And in a landscape that is as volatile as the AI landscape is at the moment, I think it would be premature for us to say, this is the way to do something that's only been out for a couple of years.
I see right now, like with the Gen AI stuff, particularly, and coding assistants and things like that, as like major augmenters of the practices that we kind of already are sharing with folks. So if you take like TDD or pairing, and you're like, oh, I'm going to leverage a coding assistant with my pair, or I'm going to leverage a coding assistant to sort of reframe the sort of TDD red-green refactor loop so that maybe I'm accelerating a lot faster. I see those as kind of like augmentations of practices that we have. Sure, maybe there'll be new practices that arise, but we're just like Rebecca just said, like we're very much in the experimentation phase. Folks are still experimenting with how to leverage a lot of these things effectively. So it's still a wait until we see like strong outcomes and strong acceleration from leveraging these tools.
Yeah, because I mean, these practices are really, there are things that we usually do, right? They're not aspirational, because I have some aspirational things around infrastructure, because it's like, I feel like, this is one of my things when I give like talks or whatever. I'm always like complaining about the current state of infrastructure as code and the way that I feel that we have a ways to go. And so I think we should be moving towards doing things in a different way. But I'm not going to say that, well, those should then be our default practices, because they're not. People aren't working that way yet. We don't have the tools out there to work that way yet. So yeah, it's not, our sensible default practices aren't aspiration. They're not, these are real, which is, I guess, another thing that maybe people should understand, because I think sometimes, you run into people who are like, oh, all of these things around pairing and test-driven development, like they're great ideas that people write about and talk about, but no, don't really work that way, right? And it's like, no, we do. These are the real things we do.
And I'll stick a plug in here because Kief won't. If you want to learn more about infrastructure as code, Kief wrote a book called Infrastructure as Code that you can find at major bookseller close to you. Anyhow. So, another thing that, and this is going to be the former military enemy creeping out, I must admit. Often when a choice is made on a way of executing a plan, when there's debate about it, and as we mentioned, some of these are not necessarily obvious. Some of the sensible defaults are not obvious. And folks don't necessarily, well, that's not how I would have done it. And so, okay, fine, I'll try, but they don't really do it. And, Kief, we were chatting the other day and you mentioned the phrase, disagree and commit. How do we, and I guess, Brandon, I'm going to look to you because you've been, because you're relatively new to this role, you've been on teams. How do you handle that? And whether it be sensible defaults or otherwise, when you're on a team and you're really not in 100% agreement on how to do something, it's a new AI tool, whatever it is. How do you get a team to not necessarily be in 100% agreement, but still commit and give it their best shot so that that it was the idea that worked or did not work and not the team?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably like this. These are probably the major challenges that most teams face from a day-to-day experience. I find the most effective way is just sort of leading with with empathy and trying to hear what thoughts most folks have to say. But then at the end of the day, we don't all have to exactly agree, but we can come to an agreement that we want to go in one direction and test that out for a certain period of time and see what the outcome is. And if we find out that idea didn't work out, then maybe we can change course to another direction. So it's really just making sure that you're having those conversations with your team, listening to their concerns, and then also addressing those concerns in some capacity. But at the end of the day, you still need to make a decision going forward if we don't all come to an agreement, so that you can sort of start driving towards some type of outcome that can lead you in a better direction later on.
So I think often when people are unsure about certain practices, it's because they haven't used them and seen them in action, right? And they're you get used to a different way of working. And that's what and it can be strange to kind of like, a different way just kind of seems wrong, right? It's not what I was taught. It's not how I'm used to working, and I don't know necessarily how to do it effectively. I think like there's really no substitute for doing it with a group of people, with a team of people who are familiar with it. I mean, that was the thing for me, again, when I joined my first Thoughtworks team. And some of these practices that I'd kind of read about and kind of played around with, like say test-driven development, like, oh, I tried, it was hard, right? And I couldn't really kind of make it work. And so I wasn't sure about it. And then working on a team where they were using it. And then I kind of like, there's a lot of like nuances to how they made it work. And it was really mind opening, right? I think it's about also like asking people to just kind of give it a chance. Let's kind of work with it. Let's kind of go with it, see how it works. And then once you kind of been doing it for a while, you have a little bit better, I guess, experience of seeing what it is. Then we can kind of talk about whether, you still think maybe it's not the best. I think another thing as well is a lot of these practices are complementary to each other. So things like pairing and TDD and the continuous merging and integrating and testing of code, all of that kind of works together very effectively. And sometimes if you decide I don't want to do one of them or another, they all kind of come apart, right? And don't necessarily work as well. So I think it is important to that we give it a real go.
Yeah, I think Kief touched on a great point there, right? Like, it's like almost a combination multiplier of some of these practices together that we've seen, like where we see a lot of huge outcomes from. And it's not just the combination of practices within one of our communities. It's a combination of practices across our communities as well that we get the huge multiplier as well. So like, if we're just going to focus in just on one, that may not be the best strategy, because then now you're just over optimizing for maybe this one practice. And maybe it's just take a step back and look holistically at how you want to approach your delivery overall, and how do you want those different roles to collaborate, and how do you want them to work together. I think that's where the true unlock happens for most teams.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And I guess I want to ask Rebecca, because I know you're the executive sponsor for a couple of the other communities. It's easy to think of software development in TDD. Okay, that's a sensible default. But what about other don't want to say non-technical, because they're very, very technical. But what about the design type communities and those types of communities? What sensible defaults look like for them?
Well, one of the things that you'll see that's now on the website and published is that there are actually two different kinds of sensible defaults. We've spent a lot of time talking about the more practice-based sensible defaults, but some of these are more principles. When we look at the design community, it's less about what is the process that you're going to use to create a design, and more about what should that particular process look like? Because it might, as an example, involve some kind of user research, but you can't just say do user research, because what if your users are remote? You might have a different process. What if your users are intermediaries, which we try to avoid whenever possible because we want to talk about the real users? Many times, for example, with customer service applications, they won't let you talk to somebody who's actually on the phone or online doing customer service. They want you to talk to the supervisor. And the only thing you're going to hear from the supervisor is how the supervisor thinks it should work, not what the day-to-day experience is. So there are principles there that are less like practices, just simply because there is perhaps a broader scope to them. And so it was interesting in stepping back and looking at, okay, this is what the design sensible defaults look like versus the infrastructure and QA and analysis. And you can see that there's the common thread of this is based on how we actually work on things. But what constitutes a sensible default in infrastructure is a different kind of thing than what constitutes a sensible default in product. And that's why I think it's so important that it's the individual communities of practice that are responsible for their area. rather than saying, okay, we're going to designate one person, to come up with all of them across all of the crafts, because they're very different things. They require different competencies. And yet they're all targeted at the same goal, which is we want to deliver products and services and technology that delights our customers. We want to do it as quickly as possible. We want the whole fast feedback and visibility. That's an underlying enabler for many of the practices across all of the different crafts. And so I think it was important to allow the individual communities to focus on the things that mattered most to them, because they do look in some ways very different from each other. But then in some ways as well, you can see that they are all of a piece. As Brandon pointed out, all of those things have to work together.
Yeah, I think that's really important. They have to work together because, and especially when you look at those things like the fast feedback, and you look across, because certainly we've kind of worked with people in organizations where it wasn't everybody involved in the overall process on the same page about things. And so you might have somebody trying to do, we're going to do fast feedback. We're going to kind of do, frequent deployments, continuous delivery. But like maybe the design wasn't working in that way. The design was like, we're going to produce a final design and hand it over, and then it's going to be implemented, or vice versa, where you have kind of product people who want to get continuous feedback from their users. Having the way that we're doing the software delivery and the project management and everything all kind of aligned to make that happen. Like that's what I think makes the magic. It's not just like different pockets, each kind of doing things the way they think is best. But like we do have that, as you say, the common, the thing that underlies all of it.
Then I guess for the final question, Brandon, I'm gonna address this to you because you had mentioned when we talked about why publish the secret sauce, it's like, well, it's one thing to read it, it's another thing to do it. For our listeners, are these all just for elite teams and practitioners, or can they go to the website and get some things that they can put into practice tomorrow?
No, I think there's plenty of practices that you can start implementing on your teams today, right? Like if you wanted to start pairing, I know there's a lot of perceived friction against that. But like you could start pairing your devs tomorrow, and they could start working on cards. Obviously, you'll have to figure out what best works effectively for that team and different nuances in there. But these are type of practices that you could try to start introducing into your teams as soon as possible. There may be some where there's a little more like organizational friction that you'll need to push against and work towards against, but you'll have to figure that out as you go through each of the practices. But I would say there are some things that we're thinking about as a community of practice around sort of like maturity models in each of the practices and things of that nature, so that we can start meeting organizations where they are and sort of bring them further and further along in terms of sort of starting adopting some of these practices and thinking about how they implement them within their organization.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people tell me that like these practices aren't realistic for like your average developer. That Thoughtworks, you guys are like you all are you hire the kind of the best people, and so they can do these kind of extra special things. And it's true to a certain extent that it's hard, right? Some of these things, like if you don't know how to do it, it's like, it's like exercising or something. If you don't do it often, then it's going to be hard to do. When you do it a lot, it gets easier. And so the thing I always say is, we're not, the fact that we don't use these practices because we're special and able to use them. It's like, if we are more effective, than maybe some other teams, it's because we use these practices, right? So by using these practices, you can, anybody can use these practices and become good. So I think that's a really important thing to understand.
Great. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your help. And for the listeners, don't hesitate to check out them on the website and a little bit of insider information. Other things to follow, I'm sure, other content around our sensible default practices. So thank you, Kief. And thank you, Brandon. And thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.